Sometimes it really sucks to see what happens to a game that's really out of its control. Cuphead has become the unfortunate spearhead of the discussion of difficulty versus accessibility in games. Which, look, I'm going to be honest, is a worthwhile discussion to have. The problem is that the pieces that started this version of the discussion were very... well, let's just say that the language used didn't start a discussion, but more so made a statement. Which is sad, because Cuphead, your friendly neighborhood side-scrolling shooter, came out for the Xbox One, Steam, the Windows Store, and GOG on September 29th, 2017 for $19.99. While there's a little bit of platforming in a couple of stages, the core of the game is a staple mechanic of a lot of genres, the boss fight. It's just you, a small health bar, and your wits against a variety of nasty flowers, vegetables, and various modes of transportation. So, does Cuphead live up to the reputation that it's earned? Is it the modern-day fusion of Contra and Shadow of the Colossus of video game difficulty? Because that's a lot more apt comparison than Dark Souls. Does the presentation do more than just give you something pretty to look at? Or will another Great Depression occur after playing through the game, leaving players frustrated and in a massive debt of enjoyment? That's what I'm here to find out. Normally, I wouldn't start this review talking presentation, but let's face it, if you were initially interested in Cuphead, it was probably due to this. We really haven't seen a game of this notoriety with this style before. It's weird too, because let's face it, how many people have actually watched the cartoons and the style that Cuphead is emulating, at least in the modern day video game landscape? I mean, hell, even GameSpot themselves have gotten caught not understanding some of the presentation decisions that were made here. Because, well, there's a lot under the hood to unpack. Let's not beat around the bush here. Cuphead looks amazing. It's one of those presentations that even those who may not like this style can't help but appreciate, because it's so different from everything else on the games market right now. Its vibrant use of color draws your eyes, using relatively simple designs and line work. Most of the foreground uses very solid coloring, not using shades or any techniques other than dump color function in paint. That is contrasted a bit with the background, which uses shading a tiny bit more, but more on that later. A lot of why the presentation here is so awesome is the fact that Studio MDHR stayed true to the original techniques that were used in the 1930s on cartoons such as Betty Boop. And that means that every frame of animation was hand-drawn on paper. Think about that in a video game perspective for a second. That's amazing. The only part of the process that ended up being digital here was the coloring. The amount of effort shows in every aspect of the visuals, specifically the animation. The animation is so gosh darn crisp, it's scary. And that's because it's not bound by a set of physics or models with originature. The artists were allowed to make everything flow the way they wanted it to flow, and not make compromises based on the game's engine. That's why everything seems to be so gosh damn natural for the character, despite the fact that this is a world of cartoons. And it's every model. It's the skeleton horse, who does a gallop-like motion like a jockey would on a horse, not looking awkward at all while it throws horseshoes and presents at you. It's why a genie unfolding his magic carpet to reveal a golden chest filled with scimitars looks like something you'd see out of a magic show. And you can't pause the frame to find some model that's out of place there. It just works so well. Which then allows Studio MDHR to fully take advantage of that and bring the emphasis on the theme of the presentation, over-exaggeration. It allows for this cuckoo bird to have his head transform into a whistle when he's angry, then fire all these feathers around, and it still looked like it was all one character. It allows for this cigar to be put out by a giant foot when you defeat him, like you would with any cigarette of your own. But don't smoke, kids. Please don't smoke. What I love about this presentation is the layers of detail that help add to this world, but don't take actually away from the gameplay. Take this beehive here. It's a workers' colony, so of course it's an office building. You got desks and typewriters in some of the places, but there's nice little touches like lights that are actually looking like honeycombs themselves. Now, there are some inconsistencies. I do wonder exactly what the liquid is supposed to be that's going to kill me if I touch it here. Honey? Does honey bubble like that? Is it supposed to be acidic? I'm confused. Is it gonna flood everything in this building? All that extra detail, however, is done in a different style, which is less colorful, but it doesn't draw your attention too much, allowing you to focus on the action in front of you. Somehow in all the accolades that are being dropped on Cuphead, one thing that seemingly gets constantly overlooked is the sound design. I don't know how, because it deserves to be on the same pedestal as the music and the visuals, because it's pretty darn fantastic. Sounds are crisp and clean with a distinct quality, some of the best quality that I think I've heard in a while, and hits a large range thanks to the enemy variety. You get things like deep boat horns when the mermaid boss yells, throwing ghosts at you, but then you get explosions of when you turn into an atom bomb and hit an enemy. That may sound a little soft at first, but it still gives you the impression of the explosion right away. There's also the machine gun-like sounds that come from this flower, which makes a lot of sense considering, well, he's acting like a machine gun of sorts. Now, like I mentioned, the theme to this presentation is exaggeration, but in the sound department, it's a little bit different here. Sure, you do have sounds that match that make sense to the situation, like the sound of a whistle coming from a cuckoo bird. But what's important to note is that the sound has priority levels based on what threat it's trying to tell you about. If a threat is off screen, for example, and is going to come in very soon, that sound is going to be loud as hell. But if it's something you should see already and should already notice it to dodge, it's going to be a bit quieter. Projectiles being fired on screen are somewhere in the middle, enough that you can notice it, but not enough to take over anything else. I always say that the design needs to complement the gameplay, and guess what? This is perfect for the gameplay they are going for, especially in conjunction with the visuals. It allows you at times to focus on the immediate threats, and only work your way towards a part of the screen with your eyes if you get that notice via the sound. But it doesn't oversaturate you either, making you want to turn the sound off. The test where I turn the sound off to see what kind of impact it has on gameplay, yeah, it had a huge one on my gameplay here, as I struggled to get through parts with the sound off. That should tell you something. I also want to briefly mention that the voice work, despite it not being there that often, is really well done. The Cuphead line after you beat a level, I sorta want to hear it over and over again. It's relaxing in a way. The laughs also should get a mention considering they are exactly what you'd expect from an old-timey cartoon. Over the top, villainous, and well, just makes me want to laugh along with them. Take a listen and hear what I'm talking about. Finally, the music. Just damn. I mean, how often do you hear these 30s or 40s tunes in games and have them be distinct from one another over time? For me, they all start to blend together. And yet, Cuphead's music doesn't do that at all. It hits a gambit from that old era, but really empowers the gameplay with good bursts of action and crescendos. Not only is the music appropriate for the time and the feelings that it's trying to capture, it's also appropriate to the level. What do I mean? Well, take the genie fight for example. That's probably the most obvious. The use of flutes and wind instruments like you'd associate with a snake charmer show up in the music and are used rather well. But meanwhile, back to that nasty flower, the music has elements of almost a military flavor, something you'd hear to wake up the troops in the old classic movies, which actually somewhat fits the flower and the way he does things, especially the machine gun-like attack that he does. Now, it's not all unique here. Some of the more generic levels, in particular the running gun levels, have music that's a little bit forgettable in the long run. But it's contrasted by the times where the vocals are brought out, and my god, who the hell is singing here? And how do I get his other work? Because I took time just to dance as Cuphead to him while in between missions. Regardless, the music here is pretty spot on for the game and is of a great quality. Just listen and hear what I'm talking about.
Mr. King Dice, I'm the gamest in the land. I never play nice, I'm the devil's right-hand man. I can't let you pass, cause you ain't done everything. Bring me those contracts, come on, bring them to the king. If you haven't finished your plans, haven't worked assiduously, no, I cannot let you pass. Don't you mess with me.
So okay, you learn that Cuphead can make your eyes do a vibrant Charleston across the screen, while keeping your ears still buzzing to its hip beats. But what about the actual gameplay in question? The majority of the gameplay here, as mentioned before, is the boss battles. You enter each boss battle with a small health bar with no way to recover health lost, 2 weapons, and the ability to dash in any direction. You've also got a super meter that you earn as you do damage to your foes, which turn into cards to play at any time. Using one card will launch a heavier attack of your current weapon, while using all of them at once will use your equipped super move, which there are 3 available ones in the game. So this skill set, nothing new in the genre. However, the unique aspect of the combat here that's different is the parry system. You'll notice once in a while that there are these pink-colored bullets or enemies. Jumping into them and hitting the jump button again will perform a parry, which will take out the enemy and give you a little bit of meter to boot. Now, be aware that while you're getting used to the timing needed here, this can be a risk at times, and considering your low life bar, sometimes it ain't worth that risk. More on that in a bit though. With the basics out of the way, let's talk about the controls and the system's precision. Cuphead keeps things rather simple when it all comes down to it, not focusing on an abundance of chaos like Japanese SHMUPs, but not giving you enough room to erect a house on where you will dodge. It's a good balance here space-wise, but that's only in conjunction with recognizing enemy firing patterns and behavior due to the screen space. From the get-go, controlling Cuphead is a breeze. Well, as soon as you make a certain adjustment that I'll talk about in the technical section of this review. Now, I feel like I've said the following for the 3rd review in a row, but it holds true in all the reviews' cases. The speed and the amount of control given to you makes sense given the enemies here and the patterns that you will face, similar to the space portion as I just mentioned. The dash in particular is of note here, because once you start to dash in a direction, You cannot change direction until the animation is complete. That means that dashing has a consequence if you react to something too quickly, which is something that I'm glad to say that Cuphead takes full advantage of. In fact, it's the core of one of Cuphead's greatest strengths, the variety of its bosses and how it uses them to challenge you without feeling repetitive and yet feeling familiar at the same time. In total, there are around 20 or so different boss-like battles in the game, which may not sound like a lot at first when you consider that it's the majority of the game's content and how quickly you can take down a boss once you get the hang of things. I mean, there's a reason why there's a completion time here. But this is a game about the journey of overcoming the task in front of you more than anything else, and specifically overcoming your failures over and over again. Learning is the name of the game here. What you learn in one battle can help you in the next, but can also hinder you in certain ways if you're stubborn enough not to adapt. Skill does play a part, of course, getting yourself into the right position and hitting enemies with the right aim and right timing. But Cuphead, in my mind, actually puts the emphasis on that adaptation and the willingness to adjust to enemy behavior, and using your positioning more than anything else. On Island 2, the fight with Beppy the Clown has a common theme throughout the fight, using jump and jump dashes to move through the fight without taking damage, but having to recognize a safe space to do that in before you jump. For example, the first phase has these ducks, which you may have to hit in order to give yourself more room to jump over Beppy's bumper car. You can still make it without it, but it requires reasonable precision, and there's no reason not to continue firing during this time, considering the damage you may get on the boss. Keep that point in the back of your mind, by the way, because that'll come up later. The second phase emphasizes that jump in a similar way, but this time, it's slow-moving homing dog balloons you have to pop, and the roller coaster car having spikes or enemies on certain platforms. So, not only do I have to worry about jumping into these dogs, I have to make sure my landing is opening on where I decide to land and where I decide to start doing more damage from the ground. But let's then move to a different fight in the area, the battle against this dragon. What I've learned from the balloon fight still applies here to an extent. I have to hit these clouds and not dash into the ground while still worrying about aerial projectiles. So I've adapted a bit and gotten better as a result for the game. But here's the kicker towards the end of the fight. The dragon starts throwing these bubble fireballs at you, and if you pop them, they end up quickly launching 4 flames in the cardinal directions, probably hitting you in the process because you probably had to be on the horizontal angle to hit it. Now, up to this point, the amount of times where you don't want to be firing is rather minimal, if not zero. But my stubbornness on this portion of the fight of continuing the fire and not adjust to the situation at hand was punished repeatedly, having me retry it over and over and over again. But once I realized what the game was trying to teach me, then it became easier, and I chose my spots to fire. And lo and behold, that skill played a part in later fights when I decided to pull it out. Which leads me to the subject that everyone and their mothers are talking about with this game, the game's difficulty. I'm gonna be honest, I'm not sure why Cuphead is becoming the target for the discussion of difficulty in games. Maybe it's the juxtaposition of the cartoonish style that's childlike compared to the difficulty. Maybe it's just the timing of the season, coupled with the lack of news and discussion of other topics. Whatever the reason is, I'm here to say that yes, Cuphead does have some difficulty to it. And if you have a fear of failure, you need to stay far, far away from Cuphead. With that said, I sit here and wonder if anyone who truly thinks Cuphead is one of the most difficult games they've ever played would think of a game like Mushi Hime-sama, or any Japanese shmup. Granted, in those games, there's tools to help you too, but Cuphead is pretty generous when it comes to the tools at your disposal. The different weapons that you can equip are very specific to certain playstyles that you'll need to use during specific boss fights, which will make them a lot easier. If you focus on dodging more than anything else during a particular fight, maybe the homing weapon is good for you. If you're confident you can get close to a boss, then use the spread shot. It'll up the damage considerably. And we're not talking split-second reaction times here, although you do need to keep your eyes moving all the times for any developing patterns. If you know what's coming, then you've got time to move and keep your eyes on things while getting a tiny bit of damage in. But that's the key, isn't it? Knowing what's coming. And that leads to the game's semi-weakness. Sure, there are random patterns in the game when it comes to bullet sequences at times, but even those are semi-rare. Once you figure out exactly what's going on, the challenge doesn't necessarily hold up on replaying the boss. You still may die, but you feel like you've already mastered it, which is somewhat the design here. The fact is, you're supposed to get further and further into the boss, failing and failing and failing, but then master the earlier sections, and then make it to the parts you have trouble with. But once you've gotten through the fight for the first time, the only real reason you would go back is for the expert mode, and yeah, it provides a challenge, but it still loses something in the long run. I do need to make one thing clear, however. That structure can lead to some really frustrating moments because of the design. Specifically, when you can't practice something other than getting to that section of the fight. An example, this Dice Man boss fight has you go through other bosses before you get to him. The last phase of the fight has him basically do one attack, this card sequence, where you have to jump and parry on these pink cards. Now, that sounds alright, but there's a catch here. There's some mechanism that allows for you to parry and jump multiple times in a row, but I'm not sure what that is. I failed to even get through one sequence of this card attack without taking damage. That's right, the only reason I was able to get through it was earning the extra lives before the battle and earning it via perfection, and then just busting through things. In addition, there were times I questioned the hit detection during my playthrough. Granted, it was only a few times in the game, but when you've only got 3 to 4 hits you can take, and you lose a life to a questionable hit, you start to wonder in a couple of instances. Looking at these specific sections on review, I am bothered a tiny bit because it seems like in a couple cases, I really didn't get hit. Especially on this devil portion with this attack here. I also probably should mention the more traditional platforming sections of the game. A little history lesson for you first. Cuphead originally didn't have any plans for these sections of the game. They were asked to add them by Microsoft. And while they may feel a little disjointed from the rest of the game, the side-scrolling and platforming sections still provide a reasonable challenge compared to the boss fights. And they are necessary to getting upgrades for your character from the game shop. They just, I don't know, they feel like a different game entirely. With all that I've said about the gameplay, let's take a moment to talk about the technical side, considering I played on the PC. 60 FPS with minimal frame drops. Actually, to be quite frank, almost 0 frame drops for 90% of the game. The only time I noticed the problem was on the second to last boss battle, specifically when parrying multiple times in a short period on the Dice Man boss battle. And frankly, that slowdown was sorta useful, to be honest. However, what should be really commended for Cuphead is its load times. Seriously, they are pretty minimal, which is important in the boss rush genre, considering, you're trying about 20 times to take down a boss. Now, there is an initial cost in some cases, as the longest load time I saw was about a minute before a battle loading for the first time. But then it drops to nearly less than 5 seconds to start again, so I really can't hold that against it. As for options, you have your standard sound sliders for sound and music. Resolution goes up to 1080p and allows for both full screen and windowed mode, but no borderless windowed mode. You've got VSync, but you got minimal graphics adjustment options like color bleed and brightness. Now, I do understand this because the graphical nature of Cuphead, well, it's a bit unique, and I'm not sure standard quality sliders would make any sense here. One note here on the options. Thank God for bindable keys on both the keyboard and the controller. Specifically the controller, because one of the strange things about Cuphead is the default controller settings. Studio MDHR, why bind the default shoot button to X? Or specifically, Why bind that to X and the dash to Y? It's awkward for this playstyle because you'll need both, and your thumb really wants to hit one or the other in this case. Here's a word of a veteran advice for those who pick up the game and use a controller. Make right bumper dash and make the right trigger shooting from the get-go. You'll thank me later. Alright, I've covered everything else up to this point, so let's finally talk a tiny bit about the story. Cuphead and Mugman are two childish-like figures who find themselves taken in by a mysterious dice man to play at the Devil's Casino. They find themselves doing well at the casino when they are given a chance to gamble it all, and Cuphead foolishly takes his chances. This results in both of them owing their souls to the devil, unless they decide to collect the soul contracts of other gamblers who haven't paid up. This is what leads you to track down those various bosses that you battled and beat the crap out of them. That's the game's setup, and to be frank, the majority of the traditional straightforward story content. Sure, you get an update cutscene here and there, but this story is only there to serve as a vessel for the gameplay. Most of the game's story and charm comes from the characters themselves. When you get defeated, for example, and they sling a one-liner at you, it feels to the world and that character immediately. The personalities each boss shows comes in their attacks, whether it be the loudmouth mermaid or the wily and resourceful rat. It would have been nice, however, to flesh out the world behind it, and the story about what the devil has meant to this world and how he controls it. But the game just didn't focus on it. It focused on the gameplay. One last thing I want to mention is that the game does a fantastic job in sneaking in references left and right, and not just those of popular media. Sure, you've probably seen that these Frog Brothers do the opening poses of Akuma and Ken at the start of their match. It's then taken a step further with the flies in the background cheering you on, very similar to the old Street Fighter games. But even the use of the bosses themselves take advantage of the nature of what they are representing. The carrot, for example. The symbolism of it having a third eye, when carrots are always rumored to be good for your eyes? Okay game, well played. Sure, the onion boss is a little bit on the nose with its crying, but it does a great job of over-exaggeration along with the presentation. In the end, Cuphead brings a lot of good things to the table. The presentation is divine, the gameplay is solid, and the atmosphere created here is pretty darn good. It's got the formula for one of the best games of the year. And yet, when I think about the top tier of games released this year, Cuphead doesn't get to that level, at least not the bar that this year has set. It's missing that next level of gameplay, the one that you'd want to come back to after all is said and done. Sure, it gives a lot more challenge in the expert runs it all, but it's that replayability over time that lacks variety-wise. But the first run through is brilliant, and those little problems here and there definitely don't drag the game down that much, as Cuphead comes in just on the edge at a 90 out of 100. Meaning it's a day one buy, even if you're hurting for cash. And yes, I understand that's comical, considering this review is several weeks late. But you know, the whole job thing and all. But that doesn't take into account my enhancer system. Games are too specialized, and there's too many taste for a regularly scored review to really take that into account, at least in my opinion. So while I keep the main score objective as possible, I have an enhancer system for the more subjective elements. If you fall into one of these categories, add or subtract that score to the base score of this game. If your first digit of your new score changes, check the scoring guide for where the game lies on the buyability scale for you now. And for reference, I will be highlighting where I lie on the enhancer scale with this color scheme for enhancers going forward. Note that I'm not done with Cuphead. A Design Bite video will be coming up next on the channel regarding a feature they have and how it helps with difficulty. Then I will be trying to also get another video done this week for a critical eye on Holy Potatoes. What the hell? No, seriously, Holy Potatoes, what the hell is the title of the game. I'll see you then. And as always, keep on gaming.